Welcome to Gatecrashers, a podcast dedicated to kicking open the doors to your next favorite thing. Our mission, our creed, and our code is this: to make all nerdy things more approachable and accessible to everyone. We want you to find a universe that you'll fall in love with. I'm Dan, I use he, him pronouns. Today we're joined by Rodney Barnes, who has been a writer and executive producer for shows like Everybody Hates Chris, The Runaways, American Gods, and so many more. But today we're going to be talking about his comic, Killadelphia. Rodney, how are you?
Doing well, thank you.
I'm very excited to have you here.
Well, thank you very much.
Killadelphia has been one of those comics that feels authentically like Philly. We'll get into that a little bit in my questions, but we like to start off with kind of like a hard-hitting question.
Okay.
Sometimes it stumps our interviewees. What's your favorite sandwich?
Turkey on rye, lettuce, tomato, mayo, sometimes provolone.
Okay, you knew that right off the bat.
I've been eating it my entire life.
Yeah, that was a quick one. And usually people have to think about it, but I like that.
As a foodaholic, my palate is pretty simple. So I only eat like 7 things. So I pretty much know the 7.
7 things. All right. So one of our listeners, Jimmy Gasparo Jr., asked, what inspired you to use specific historical figures that you have so far in Killadelphia?
So often, folks say that history doesn't play a role in present day events. I've heard that everywhere from my kids who aren't huge history fans and to just folks in politics, who speak about history as though, it doesn't necessarily affect modern day life. And I think that I've never felt that to be true. I think there's a direct line between the past and the present. And so it just felt like if I could give a voice to, the past, that would be incredibly helpful.
Out of all of the cities, why Philadelphia?
Philadelphia has a unique place in American history. The Liberty Bell, a lot of historical artifacts and things directly relating to the creation of America exist in Philadelphia. And also, juxtaposed to that, you also have a lot of the ills of the inner city. Violence, unemployment, high crime rates, homicide rates, all of that. It felt like, there was an irony that was there, more so than in any other city. Philadelphia just sort of fit the bill for what was under the story I'm trying to tell.
Absolutely. I think it works perfectly. How do you kind of get that Philly flavor in your story? Like, do you do specific research? How do you kind of put that into words? Most cities sort of have their own ecosystems, but they also have some similarities. I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, but I also lived in Baltimore for a while. So I understood that, there's a pulse to most cities that's unique. And I went to Philly. I did a little bit of research in the actual city of Philly, and then I read a lot as well about the city. And I know some folks from Philly, and I talked to them as well about specifics, certain nuance and specificity as to how the culture of the city works. And so I try not to make it too heavy-handed, but every once in a while I'll try to add garnish with a little bit of slang or a particular landmark that might feel familiar to folks from Philly, just a little bit, not too much. So there you go.
Seesaw at one point says John. And
Yes.
I was like, yep, that's
Yes.
it. It's like,
Yes, yes. And the thing is, I've seen some, like I think Creed, and there are a couple of other films or TV shows where every third word was John, or
Yeah.
and I didn't want it to be that, but just to remind you where you are, I wanted to put a little bit in there.
yeah, because sometimes when I'm talking to people like online and things, I'll use the word John and they're like, what does that even mean? I was like,
Yes.
it's just like a word replacement.
Yes, exactly.
So I know you said you only eat 7 things. Is one of those things cheesesteaks?
Not as much. When I was younger, we had a couple of restaurants in Annapolis that made cheesesteaks, and I dug them a lot. As I got older, not so much. Just because, health-wise, if you do too many cheesesteaks, you won't be able to log in these 14, 16-hour days sitting at a desk.
Yeah.
You can't do both.
You fall
It's
asleep.
usually the two things that kind of do you in. And so there you go.
Did you include pretzels in the first volume as a nod to the unholy amount of soft pretzels that Pennsylvanians eat every year?
That and the unholy amount of pretzels I eat. That's one of the 7 things. They raise your triglycerides. Nothing against, just to warn the pretzel eaters out there. I consume an obscene amount of pretzels, whether they're soft, hard, or someplace in between. And I remember when I was in Philly, there was a stand where someone was selling pretzels. So I said, you know what? I'm going to sell a pretzel in this thing. Have someone eating a pretzel.
I did some research a while back because my girlfriend and I was trying to explain the pretzel thing to her. Pennsylvanians eat 12 times the amount of the average American in pretzels, and
I did not know that.
80% of America's pretzels are made in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
There's some very weird statistics on pretzels in PA. So when I saw that, I was like, this feels like genuine. So you did it.
Well, thank you. Now I feel even like I feel like I cheated in a way. I had no idea that was actually true, but yet I stumbled upon it. Sometimes you get lucky like that.
Yeah, you nailed it. We just won't tell anybody that you did it on purpose.
Yes. I meant to do that. Hershey Park will be next, and I had that in it.
Yeah, it's kind of like some of the scenes where like the vampires spill out into Philly. Kind of looks like when the birds win. So I was like, oh, this feels like home.
Yes.
Get a little weird having them go to Hershey Park to have a nice day, but
Hey, that's where we used to go when I was a kid. Once a year, we went to Hershey Park. So yeah.
I've only been there one time. It's an interesting place, especially because if you stay in their hotel, all of their shampoos and soaps smell like chocolate.
Well, I see. I've never stayed in a hotel. It was a day trip. So we would go up until we got tired and then had to drive back. But yeah.
You drove? Oh, yeah. That's a long drive, too.
Annapolis it wasn't too bad, Annapolis to Hershey Park. If you leave at like 5 a.m, I guess.
Yeah.
And you're a kid, so you sleep most of the way and you wake up, you're in Hershey Park. It's like a dream.
It's a great day.
Yeah.
So when working with co-creator Jason Sean Alexander, do you plot out the story beforehand with each other and then you script?
No, I plotted all out in my head way beforehand, and then I put it to paper. I share it with him, and he doesn't read it because he'll ask me questions as he's doing each issue, and I'm like, "You didn't read that thing that I sent you, did you?" But that's as much for me as it is for the entire team. I think. I kind of work off of theme more than anything else. And I have to understand the theme, so I have something to always come back to sort of give the arc a feeling like, I love the way The Wire used to always feel like at the end of the season, it was like closing the chapter, closing a book, like you had finished an entire book. And there was another one coming when the next season would come. And I sort of wanted Killadelphia to feel the same way. Like you were reading a book and, that those 6 issues sort of told a complete story. So, yeah.
It does read that way. I've read both of them in chunks because, I don't want to have to wait another week to see what happens. But then I got to the end of this volume and you did me a doozy there. And I was like, oh, come on.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
It
was
is
just too much story. It was so much story. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of themes in this one that I would like to get into. But before we get into the actual story of it, I read in one of them that you've had this idea in your head for a long time.
Yes.
What made you bring it to life as a comic book rather than another medium?
I tried to do it in another medium, and everybody said no. When I first got to Hollywood, I tried to do it as a feature film, and then I tried to do it as a TV show. And to lesser or greater degrees, everyone had something to say about why it shouldn't exist. And then I went back to Old Faithful, which was comic books. That love of this thing I've loved my entire life. And by happenstance, Jason and I became friends, and I used to pitch it to him all the time. And finally, he went for it. But yeah, this wasn't the book wasn't the first shot at trying to get this out there.
Interesting. And what kind of freedoms has comics allowed you that other mediums wouldn't?
Especially because it's image, and you don't really, I had to find an editor. Like usually at Marvel or DC, they give you an editor. And you sort of can tell the story that you want to tell unfiltered. And that's the beauty of it. And, and not necessarily disparaging those TV and film folks that said no. There were a couple of comic book companies that said no as well. And a lot of it was they couldn't see all of the parts coming together. They just didn't see it. And I think it is a difficult pitch if you're not me trying to explain to someone what this is. It's a lot of moving parts. And even sometimes when I'm sitting down to write an issue, I have to figure out, okay, what is it I'm trying to say with this issue, and who are the characters that are going to best suited to tell the story. It's not a simple thing.
So some of these questions I'm going to ask moving forward will have spoilers for the second arc of Killadelphia. So if you want to read the issues and then come back, feel free to do so. So in Burn Baby Burn, we get more of Toppy's backstory. Toppy's entire look is like super captivating. Like you always, anytime he's on a page, you're infatuated with him. What was the inspiration behind the character for you?
I wanted to, ever so often when you see films that you see people of color in historical context, it's typically they're either victims or it's a pretty simple story. They come from a period that's clearly defined, and they're clearly defined in it. And when it came to Toppy, I wanted his history to be a little bit more problematic. He was on the Confederate side of the Civil War. And that's not the story of like Glory, where it was the Buffalo Soldiers, that type of thing. And he has carried the anger from what happened to him in that period all the way to this day. And being immortal and being given the perspective that comes with being a vampire is sort of, he's taken that thing that's under who he is as a character, and it's walked with him to the present day. It sort of rules the idea of who he is personality-wise. And that came from my therapist, actually. My therapist was saying one day that, just in random, she was saying that, there are two types of people, both are flawed. But there's the person who identifies with their flaws and defends their flaw. And then there's a person who's constantly trying to work on their flaws and improve them. And I wanted Toppy to be from that world of he defines himself by his flaws. And that sort of meant that when I was telling his story, he had to find some semblance of validation in his hurt and in his pain. Such to the point where he can't see his role in it. And so that's where Toppy came from.
So that line exactly that you just said, the one from your therapist, I wrote it down from the book because I was like, this is gold. Like that line is so good. Mm-hmm. And there was another one that I wrote down about living being addictive, like being alive is addictive.
Yes.
Where did that line come from?
Just one day I was thinking about how, when you're a young person, I'm a really big guy. And, when I was younger and I fashioned myself to be an athlete, I never really thought about dying. I never really thought about being, how fragile life is. That never really entered into my head. You just sort of think you're immortal. You've got kind of all the time in the world. And then I had some really serious health problems about 7 years ago, closer to 8 now, I guess. And I was facing my mortality. And I started to think about, how fleeting this life is, not just how fast it is, but how fragile it all is. And when you're alive, certainly I think the ego plays into, you can't imagine it. You can't imagine not being alive. You can't imagine not existing. And, as, how can I say this, as intimidating a prospect as it is that there'll be a world that's going to go on after me. That's all ego. But it's hard to kind of imagine that, one day you're going to go and the sun is going to rise and everything's going to keep going. And the people who love you will miss you and mourn you. But ultimately, life isn't going to stop. And there's that memento mori, remember that you have to die and making the most out of your life. Vampires don't have that. That's not a part of their psyche. They are immortal, barring a stake in the heart or burn to a crisp or, whatever way that you can take them out. So it almost was like, what do you do with what happens when you take that off the table? And that idea of immortality, what does that do with the human idea of mortality? When you put those two together and there's a bridge between the two, I thought it was interesting in dealing with vampires, but I also thought it was interesting as a human being of how we kind of take our lives for granted sometimes.
It feels like you're jumping ahead in my notes here because
I'm sorry.
No. This is the best segue I ever could have had. The afterlife is such a big thematic part of this chunk of your story, this whole chapter, because we see this in between that vampires exist in. Are you going to explore that more through the rest of the world?
Yes. I mean, I think I've always wanted to. I'm curious about life. I'm curious about mythology. I'm curious about philosophy. I'm curious in general. And oftentimes, you don't really see characters of color included in that idea of the afterworld, the netherworld. And I wanted to build it up. I loved Alan Moore's version of it in Swamp Thing. And, books like Dante's Inferno and What Dreams May Come by the late, great Richard Matheson and Sandman and, a bunch of other books where they all have like their version of the dream world or heaven, hell, and all of that kind of stuff. And I wanted to come up with my own that was a little bit closer to the emotional states that we go through. Killadelphia is all about trauma. Every character is wrestling with their form of trauma, something that they've gone through. Some characters deal with it in some ways and others in others. But I guess I wanted to say that even after physically we're not here, that traumatic imprint doesn't go away. It manifests itself in one way or the other. And whoever we are at the core determines where we go. Now, that's not based on Christianity or Islam or any other religion. It's kind of a Rodneyism, something I would like to think. But, you sort of, that heaven state of idealism really comes with, you suffered, you went through things, but you still work to be your best self. So this is where you go. You're sort of rewarded for that. You still have some things to figure out. So you go to purgatory, and that's where you do that. Some people are incorrigible, and nothing can be done for them. They go to the other place. And, as long as there's a Killadelphia and as long as there's, I'm telling those types of stories, I'd love to be able to incorporate not just the, you're dead, so you're gone, and we replace you with a new character. that there's an echo of who you were that is still manifesting itself in some realm, some place, somewhere. So that's where that comes from.
Before I ask a little bit more about the religion, you mentioned how the story does deal with a lot of trauma. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that there is any through line story of generational trauma between? We've got the three. I would call them the three main characters. You've got James Sangster Sr., Jr., and then Seesaw, who's the youngest.
Yes.
Do you think each of them has their own generational trauma that they're dealing with?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, I think. The Sangster story is sort of based on my life, my relationship with my father, who's no longer with us, and my relationship with my son and my relationship with myself, and trying to figure that all out. It's like there's a period you go through where you're just in whatever discourse you're in with another person. And then there's the place where you start to get older and you start to try to figure out what you went through. And hopefully, there's some level of reconciliation that you can make somewhere along the way. That's the Sangster story. They're trying to work through their stuff. With Seesaw, it's more, it's that, but it's the story with him and his grandmother. It's his grandmother went through trauma, his mother went through trauma, his father went through trauma, and ultimately they passed that stuff down to him. And he's decided to do the best with it that he possibly can. In Arc 3, there'll be a lot of Seesaw. He's got a lot to do.
Sweet.
And so, that anytime you see him, you're kind of seeing that side of my brain that is trying to figure things out, not just in my own life, but, how I relate to the significant others in my life, my children, my family, my friends, myself. Seesaw is a thinker. And even though he sounds like Philly, in the streets of Philly, and that's purposeful because I want those people that almost seem to be forgotten in the American story to feel like there's hope somewhere along the way.
And I think I see that a lot with Seesaw. I love the character, especially what you're saying with like how he taught, like he has this certain, he sounds like Philadelphia, mm-hmm. but the way you speak doesn't match up to what your intelligence actually is.
Exactly.
Seesaw,
and I think oftentimes, but that's what you just said, I think is often in television and in movies, how you sound is sort of your character, the limitations of your character. They place the ceiling on your character. Very rarely do characters act outside of the way that they speak and the thing and where they come from. I'm sorry. There you go.
No, that. I'm so excited that I get to talk to you about this stuff because I'm sitting here thinking about it. And Seesaw, not to give any massive spoilers away, but he pretty much stands up against what looks like Satan. Mm-hmm. So if we have the idea of a Satan and Seesaw literally going to hell and just waltzing in and telling Satan what's going to happen, which was 10 out of 10, best thing that I've ever read, is there an idea of God in Killadelphia?
Yes, there is. And that's, again, when we talk about Arc 3, one of the things, and without giving too much of it away, to bring back John Adams, because John Adams, being a vampire, there's a part of dark energy that is attached to the idea of being a vampire, because a vampire is an aberration. That's something that Tevin's grandmother was talking about, in the beginning when she didn't want to live forever because that wasn't, part of the deal. We get as many years as we get, we do the best we can with them, and then we move on to the next place. A vampire is sort of against that idea. A vampire is immortal. So they're going to walk through life and they don't necessarily have to abide by the same rules. If there's a God, and within that God, has set up a dynamic, there's a purpose to life and there's a purpose to death. And the vampire is defying that just by his mere existence. And so the bringing back John Adams meant going to the place where dark energy is sort of cold, which would be hell, my version of hell. When he talks to Corson, the demon, one of the senior demons in demonology.
and makes a deal with Corson. So when you're trying to bring back a vampire, that's where you have to go. What happens when you're trying to bring back a human being? Take a vampire from a vampire state to a human state. You got to go in the other direction. So to be able to do that, and you're a vampire, meaning that you're an aberration asking for help from something that you are no longer, your existence is sort of a metaphor for something that's against goodness, so to speak, or the idea of goodness. It takes a different type of work altogether, which brings into play that entity that you just spoke of.
That is a very interesting answer, and I'm so pumped to see where that goes. We also met a new character named Jupiter, who was one of you let me know was a real person.
Yes.
And we learned a lot about him, his connection to Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
But in his time as a slave, he wore a halo. That's what they're called, right? A halo?
Yeah, they're halos.
So he still wears the mask. What is the thematic reasoning for him still wearing that?
Because he's still punished. That was his punishment, and he started to identify with that. It started to feel, it's almost like the person who, again, going back to that thing my therapist said, when you start to defend the lower aspects of yourself and define yourself as those things, I think, you can very easily create a barrier around yourself to protect yourself so that no one comes in and says, hey, you need to change in some way. I'll say for me, when I left Maryland and I came to Hollywood, I was incredibly painfully insecure and fearful. And when you add imposter syndrome to that, it just kind of is like putting gasoline on the flame. And, it took a lot of hurt, took a lot of things to humble me, to get me to a place where I started to look at myself more so than look at the things around me, or look at a certain point, you can't blame anyone for what's going on in your life, that the problematic areas of your life. I think insecurity breeds a certain type of a unique form of narcissism where you keep everyone and everything at arm's length because you're insecure. You don't want anyone to touch that thing or discover that thing about you. And the only thing that can defeat that is humility. And I think in the case of Jupiter, everything that he had known was torn away from him. And so he was left with nothing. So the halo became sort of synonymous with his identity. This is who I am. I'm the punished one. But there's an anger that accompanies that as well. It's like, why am I the punished one? And even if you're not thinking that on a conscious level, I think on a subconscious level, that's something that sort of seeps in and, again, sort of fortifies those pillars that reaffirm who you are to yourself. And again, with the vampire mythos being able to be immortal, if you don't work on those things, you carry them through life. You carry them, I guess you wouldn't call it life existence, So some 200 years later, he's still walking around with that pain and that anger. And in Jupiter's case, he wanted to let that go. He was looking for a way out of that because, if he, in the case of some entity that's immortal, 200 years becomes 400 years, becomes 1,000 years of carrying that hurt and that pain and that burden around. And, he wanted to get that up off of him.
Yeah. And it only festers as you have more time to live the way you've been living.
And the habits that come with that. It's like the thing that keeps it going, I think, that story that you tell yourself, that story that frames your life is the habits that are formed during that period of time. Because after a while, it's very easy to forget the story, or the story can fade, or you can kind of contort the story at a certain point to make it whatever you need it to be. But to keep it alive, I think we develop habits that sort of we move through life with. And whatever that is,
And Jupiter just wanted to do away with all of that.
I think the thing you mentioned earlier about how history kind of builds, it doesn't go away. I think the idea of the trauma compounding, because even when you lose those memories and things like that, and you have those habits, it's just the compounding of different things building up that you can't just easily do away with. So that makes the mask even more interesting in retrospective.
Yeah. And oftentimes in American history, we don't really deal with slavery head on. It's not part of, we have Black History Month, but it's not really in the curriculum, on a regular basis. That's not the part that we learn. It's kind of separated and off to the side. So it's a form of trauma, cultural trauma, that I don't think is really dealt with in a way that can bring healing about, sort of on the culture's responsibility to keep it alive. But that doesn't always filter down to the masses in such a way that it evokes change. So it's another form of trauma that I think Jupiter is connected to and speaks to. He wants that thing to get away, to get out of him, but he just doesn't know how to do it.
Do you think the genre, I didn't have this one written down, but this conversation is leading to, do you think that horror is a good place to explore those different traumas?
Yes. I mean, the thing that always got, people ask me all the time, why horror? Why do you love horror so much? And I think as a kid, the boundaries were clear. It was life or death. And it wasn't that so much on a regular basis. Any other genre, comedy was funny. So immediately that's sort of, it was what it was. Mystery, it doesn't necessarily have to do with death. But horror, is about whether the monster's dead or the person that he's chasing, is going to die or is in peril. But the stakes are very clearly defined. And for me, it just spoke to a certain truth that we were going to take all the BS out of the equation of this story. And I was fortunate enough as a kid to really hook into some great horror writers. I mean, Richard Matheson, I knew who Richard Matheson was before I was 10 years old, whether it was from the Night Stalker, Night Strangler, Kolchak movie of the weeks, or, like I said, What Dreams May Come, Somewhere in Time, I Am Legend, and then the greatest thing ever, Stephen King entered my life. I remember when paperback books used to be on those spinners. I remember reaching up, and like I said, I'm like 6'6", 6'7", so you can imagine how young I was, reaching up to see Carrie. And somehow, of all the books, I remember buying Carrie and I think Splinter in the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster. I bought those two books with my grass cutting money. And I fell in love with Stephen King, and it seemed like every week there was another paperback to buy and another one and another one. And, now I'm in my 50s and he's still a part of my life. And, it's just, horror has just always been there. And the personal type of horror, the horror that speaks to the humanity under the horror, was always the thing that sort of stoked my flames.
That's so interesting, because now you're saying these different voices that inspired you, you're now one of those voices who inspire other people. So seeing that is very interesting to me. So go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's still hard to accept.
Yeah.
That I'm, part of that. I just posted on the Zombie Love IG page. Someone made a post of, it had Salem's Lot, Interview with the Vampire, Dracula, a couple forms of Dracula, and Killadelphia. And they were all like there together. And it was such an honor even to be listed amongst those great books that I've loved so much. It's like, doesn't feel real.
Yeah. I read a lot of horror, and I've consumed horror since I was very young. So I think about it a lot. In the past couple of years, I've thought about it as these different traumas and what it stands in for. And Killadelphia has been, I'm not saying this to stoke your ego or anything, but it does things that no other horror book has done for me. And like, I just trying to understand these stories and see things from different perspectives. It's an incredible story. So, as I said, like this interview was so exciting for me.
No, I thank you a lot. I mean, I'll say this really quickly. When I go back to that period of time when I was really sick, there's a gentleman by the name of Devon Franklin. He's an executive in Hollywood, but he's also a pastor and he's a producer as well. And I was about to have surgery. And somehow he popped into the hospital room before I was going to go in, and he prayed for me. And it was one of those prayers that I told him that he should have saved it for the eulogy, because it was a really powerful prayer. And so we had a conversation, and I was at a really difficult point in my life where a lot of things weren't going the way that I wanted them to. And I was still at that place where I was looking outside of myself and blaming folks and, a lot of different things. And he asked me why I write, and I said, because I said, when I was a kid, I remembered being in movie theaters and in libraries and by myself. And I could lose myself in such a way that it made me feel good about being me. Like I could enjoy myself without any other. It was the story and it was me, and I was part of the story in a way because my mind had to be the voice of the characters in a way. And if it was in a movie, there was something I would leave the movie theater with that just felt good. And I wanted to give that to people. And I felt like whatever that thing that was in stories somehow was in my head too. I just didn't know how to get it out. I certainly didn't see a bridge to Hollywood. And he said, so that's a heart thing, right? And I said, yeah, it's a heart thing. And he says, is that what you're doing now? And it wasn't. And I said, no. He said, what are you doing now? I said, I'm making money. And he said, I think if you go back to working from your heart, everything would fall in place. And my heart has always been in horror. It was always been in, whether it was the creature features that were on 11 o'clock at night after the news, or it was in some Swamp Thing, Alan Moore Swamp Thing or something. That was when I felt happy. That was when I felt good. And he said, if you could write from your heart, what does that mean? And up until that point, like when I wrote Falcon for Marvel, that was an assignment. And I try, even if you look at Falcon, you'll see some of the things that were Killadelphia things. I probably should have left out and just written Falcon, but that was what I was in this place where I was wrestling with myself. And, Lando was a fun little book for me, and I wrote a lot of jokes. And Quincredible has been a nice young adult book that I think speaks very directly to the culture in a way I've always wanted to. But Killadelphia was pure heart. That was pure, like, I'm going to speak. Even sometimes when I'm writing a script, I will go back to a plot point or something that I'm doing that'll make perfect sense, but it doesn't make me feel anything. And I want the reader to feel what I'm feeling at the moment. And I think the people who've said the kind things like you just said, and the people that sort of get the book, that's my connection with, the audience, the humanity that's in the book. Ironically, that's about the inhuman, but that's my connection. That's me speaking directly to folks who may think the same way, or we might be on the same wavelength or synchronicity.
Wow. All of that hits really hard. Especially the writing for money thing is something has been on my mind a lot in the past couple of weeks. So that's very inspirational for me to hear. And I just have a couple more questions about the world. That would have been the perfect place to leave off. But with Volume 2, we got a backup, which was Elysium Gardens, which I don't. In Volume 1, was there anything but vampires?
No, it was just vampires.
So you're bringing in werewolves.
Yes.
Was that something you had planned from the start to do a backup?
I always wanted to do a backup because I loved comic books back in the day that sort of had them. There was House of Mystery and House of Secrets. And when they started to do those 100 pagers, that was a big deal when I was a kid. When I saw a book for like 50 cents, but you got 100 pages and it was like 3 stories. One of them was a reprint, so that sort of didn't count, but it did make it 100 pages. I wanted to do when I got the opportunity to do a book that was mine, I wanted to have a backup story. And fortunately, Jason had the time and bandwidth, and he kind of dug the story. And so we were able to team up on that.
As this world is being expanded upon more with the upcoming Nita Hall's Nightmare blog having a demon, when you started all this, did you have any sort of ideas of what other supernatural beings were out there?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about them was each one, whether it's werewolves, vampires, ghosts, what has zombies, mummies, they all sort of had something under them that suited the time that they were created in. Whether it was fear of war, nuclear energy, that desire for immortality, the fear of the gypsies, whatever it was, there was something that was there that spoke to humanity. And so me interpreting it in the way that I would interpret it in really was just like, it was natural. I mean, when you look at some of the books that I'm going to do over the next year or so, they all kind of speak to that idea of taking something that speaks to the things that are important to me, but using those monsters, that idea of the supernatural, to sort of elevate the idea of the story. It's almost like cherry flavoring the medicine. No one wants medicine, but if you can make it taste good, hey, I'll take it, that's sort of what I want to do with a myriad of monsters and supernatural creatures of the night. So there you go.
So our final question, if you had a Rube Goldberg machine, what would it do?
Oh my God. I mean, what Rube Goldberg machines do. I mean, I love the dominoes that fall down and how the ball will roll into the thing. I don't know of any specificities other than it would be really long and really complicated. I saw a movie recently. It's like when you said that, it made me think of, I don't know, it was some type of I think it was with Will Smith. I forget the name of it. But his kid had died, and he kept trying to stop the dominoes from falling. And then he finally let them go. I certainly think it would have a lot of moving parts to it that were creative, but each part would matter in some way and be a metaphor for something else. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's the only one I got.
Ram V once told us that his would create a singularity, so that's a great answer.
We just followed each other on Twitter. I like that, Ram V.
Ram, if you have not read These Savage Swords from Vault, that is a very, if I tell people my 2 favorite vampires, it's yours and his, so well worth the read.
Thank you. It's an honor to be mentioned alongside from Ram. We're both in Razor Blades, Steve Tynan IV and Steve Fox's magazine this month. So I think he has a short story and I'm being interviewed.
I'll be honest with you. I was very nervous about this interview because Steve is an absolute pro. So I was like, I can't follow up on an interview like his. So
you're doing great. You're doing great. You're doing great.
Razor Blades is, not to shill someone on the show, but like Razor Blades is awesome. Like that whole concept and things like that.
You know what? It's funny because it's up on because I have it in digital and it was on my computer. I just did I forget what you call it because I'm old, but I did something with a program on my desktop. And Razor Blades is there. And I was just going through, taking my time. And as a kid, I would have loved Razor Blades. I would have loved all the different art and the short stories and the interviews. And it's actually made me want to do one of those types of books because it's a labor of love. It's not something you do, I don't know, maybe those guys are making millions of dollars off of it, but you can see the passion for horror that's under it. And all of the folks that, again, I'm honored to be even mentioned in it because he's got some really, really talented pros in there. And I can say across the board, I mean, I've gotten support from a lot of folks who I've admired for a long time and just a part of the modern day horror community in comics who've been very supportive of Killadelphia. And, Razor Blades is a part of that. So, high five to all of those guys. I appreciate them a lot.
That whole project is like what is going to get more horror stuff done. But is there anything upcoming of yours that people should be on the lookout for?
Well, I started my own imprint from Zombie Love Studios. I'm going to have 3 books hopefully come out towards the end of the year. You never know in this COVID world that we're in that seems to kind of slow things. And, the best laid plans seem to be compromised at times. But one is a ghost story about a mental asylum in my hometown in Crownsville, Maryland.
Okay.
Another one is a sci-fi alien attack story written. The story is from myself and the rapper Exhibit. I guess he's an actor and a businessman too, so I'm not just going to call him a rapper. And we're putting that together. And the last one is a big title from MGM that I'm praying that they're listening to this and will finally sign off the paper so I can say it a lot louder than I've hinted over the past 2 or 3 months. But hopefully, and I'm not doing floppies, I'm just going to do a soft cover trade for each and a hardcover trade has the whole story in it. You don't have to, because I can't compete. I don't. It's all coming out of my pocket, so I don't have enough money to do floppies every month. But a lot of talented folks I'm partnering with, and Jason as well. And excited about that. And then that's through my company. With Image, there's Nita. There's Nita Hawes' Nightmare Blog, which is in the Killadelphia universe. There's a sci-fi story that myself and Jason are partnering with as well. And I'm looking to my board now. I'm doing another arc of Incredible for Lion Forge Oni Press. I'm doing a short story for Marvel, a Cloak and Dagger story that's part of the King in Black world that should be out in March. And starting the 3rd arc of Killadelphia that I'm actually a week behind. I'm sorry, Jason. I've just been really busy. And Showtime, the Lakers series that I'm an executive producer and writer on, we start filming after a year of waiting because of COVID. We start shooting mid-April. Really excited about that. And a bunch of other TV shows and movies. So it's a lot going on. I don't have much of a life other than work.
Yeah, I was going to say, when do you sleep?
It's not a lot of sleep, and there's a lot of anxiety and stress. And if I die at my desk, it'll probably be with a pen in my hand and a pad. So it won't make for a very good Dateline episode because I'll just you'll know exactly what I was doing. You'll see a box of Triscuit crackers, a Diet Coke, and a pen and a dead guy.
Well, that is actually a really good way to leave this interview.
Yeah.
You can find us at gatecrashers.fan, on Twitter at gatecrasherspod, and on Instagram at gatecrasherspod as well. We'll talk to you next week.
Gatecrashers.